This content is AI generated for informational purposes only and should not be directly used for clinical decision-making.
Hello, and welcome back to the Neurosurgery Hub podcast. I'm Dr. Aris, Senior Attending Neurosurgeon, and I'm joined today by our research fellow, Dr. Ilara.
And I'm Dr. Ilara. Today we're looking at a fascinating new study from the journal Epilepsia Open, published in 2026. The title is sEEG-Guided Responsive Neurostimulation to Treat Neocortical Epilepsy, a multicenter retrospective study of the efficacy and safety of depth electrode-mediated neuromodulation.
This is a timely paper, Ilara. For our residents and colleagues listening, we've seen a massive shift in how we approach focal epilepsy over the last decade. We've moved away from the large craniotomies for subdural grids and towards stereo-electroencephalography, or sEEG. But the question has always been, once you find the focus with sEEG depth electrodes, what's the best way to deliver long-term neuromodulation if the patient isn't a candidate for resection?
Exactly, Dr. Aris. This study really addresses that transition. It's a multi-center retrospective effort led by Sina Sadhekzadeh and the team at Stanford, but it involves a heavy-hitting list of institutions: Mount Sinai, Yale, Mayo Clinic, Thomas Jefferson, and several others. They specifically looked at the RNS system, but with a focus on neocortical epilepsy treated via depth electrodes rather than the traditional cortical strips.
Right. If we look at the history, the pivotal trials for the RNS system established its effectiveness for focal epilepsy, but a lot of that early data was heavily weighted toward mesiotemporal lobe cases or used subdural strips for neocortical targets. This study, being from 2026, reflects the more modern sEEG to RNS workflow.
And that's the key aspect here, the sEEG-guided part. The authors highlight that the diagnostic phase, the sEEG, directly informs the therapeutic phase. In these cases, the neurosurgeon uses the exact trajectories or coordinates identified during the invasive monitoring to place the permanent RNS stepped electrodes.
Let's dive into the patient population. These are patients with neocortical epilepsy. For the students listening, why is that distinction important compared to, say, mesiotemporal sclerosis?
Neocortical epilepsy is often much more heterogeneous. The seizure focus can be anywhere on the convexity and deep sulci or in eloquent areas like the motor cortex or Broca's area, where you simply cannot resect. The paper emphasizes that because these foci are often deep or poorly localized by surface EEG, depth electrodes are the ideal tool for both sensing and stimulating.
And the study design? It's a retrospective multicenter study. That's a level 3 piece of evidence, but because it's multicenter, it carries significant weight in terms of generalization across different surgical practices.
Right. They specifically evaluated the efficacy and safety of depth electrode-mediated neuromodulation. One of the most important technical points they raise is the use of these depth electrodes in the neocortex. Traditionally, we thought of depth electrodes for the hippocampus or amygdala and strips for the neocortex. But this study shows that depth electrodes can effectively target neocortical hotspots identified during sEEG.
Let's talk about the efficacy results mentioned in the abstract. While the RNS pivotal trials show a progressive improvement in seizure control over time, this study specifically looks at how the sEEG-guided approach might streamline that. By using sEEG data, the clinicians can be much more confident that the RNS leads are in the zone from day one.
The authors use the term depth electrode-mediated neuromodulation to describe this. It's a precise way of saying we are moving toward a more stereo-responsive approach. Instead of a broad strip covering the surface, we are placing the electrode contacts directly into the cortical layers, or the white matter junctions where the seizure onset is most apparent on sEEG.
Now, neurosurgeons are always concerned about safety. What does the study say about the safety profile of using these depth leads for long-term stimulation in the neocortex?
The paper notes that the safety profile is consistent with what we've seen in previous RNS studies. Because depth electrodes are placed through small twist drill holes or 2.4 mm burr holes, often using robotic assistance, the morbidity is relatively low compared to the large-scale surgery required for subdural strips. They didn't find any unexpected increased risk of hemorrhage or infection specifically linked to the depth electrodes being in the neocortex versus the temporal lobe.
That's a crucial point for residents. The sEEG-guided workflow actually simplifies the RNS implant. You aren't doing a second craniotomy to slide strips under the dura. You are often using the same entry points you already verified during the sEEG phase.
Exactly. And the multi-center nature of this study, including data from places like the University of Pennsylvania, Emory, and Oregon Health and Science, really validates that this isn't just a Stanford technique. It's becoming a standard of care across the U.S.
Let's go deeper into the neocortical aspect. Many of these patients likely had non-lesional MRIs. In those cases, sEEG is mandatory. If the sEEG shows a focus in the bottom of a sulcus, a subdural strip electrode on the surface might not sense the seizure onset early enough to trigger effective stimulation.
That's a great point, Dr. Aris. The paper implies that depth electrodes provide a higher signal-to-noise ratio for detection because they can be placed directly into the seizure onset zone, regardless of the depth from the cortical surface. This depth electrode-mediated approach allows for more granular detection.
And for our practicing neurosurgeons, let's look at the year 2026 context. By this point, the integration of robotic platforms into these procedures is the norm. The paper mentions the accuracy of these sEEG-guided trajectories, which is really the backbone of why this works. If you're off by even a few millimeters in the neocortex, you might miss the trigger.
The study also touches on the retrospective nature of the data, meaning we are looking at real-world outcomes. These are patients who have been followed for a significant period post-implant. The authors mention that the RNS system's effectiveness in these neocortical cases is comparable to, and in some metrics better than the early strip-based approaches.
One thing that stands out in the author list is the collaboration between neurosurgery and neurology. You see names like Barbara Jobst and Christopher Skigmore alongside the surgeons. This emphasizes that sEEG-guided RNS isn't just about the surgery. It's about the long-term programming and the interpretation of the electrographic data that the system records.
Yes, the responsive part of responsive neurostimulation. The sEEG phase provides the template for what the RNS should be looking for. If you know exactly what the seizure looks like on a specific sEEG lead, you can program the RNS to detect that exact signature on the corresponding permanent depth electrode.
So if we were to summarize the key takeaways for a resident preparing for boards or a case tomorrow. First, sEEG-guided placement of RNS depth electrodes is a safe and effective strategy for neocortical epilepsy. Second, depth electrodes are not just for the mesial temporal lobe, they are highly effective for targeting neocortical foci identified during invasive monitoring.
And third, the multicenter data suggests that this approach is robust. It's a shift toward more minimal access epilepsy surgery, using sEEG for diagnosis and robotic depth placement for therapy, rather than open resection or large grits.
It really represents the less is more philosophy in modern neurosurgery. Less trauma to the brain, but more precise targeting of the pathology.
Before we wrap up, I think it's worth noting the journal, Epilepsia Open. It's an official journal of the International League Against Epilepsy, ILA, which means this study underwent rigorous peer review by the global epilepsy community. The fact that they are focusing on depth electrode-mediated neuromodulation as a standalone topic shows how much the field has evolved.
Absolutely. It's no longer an off-label or experimental field. This is a primary surgical strategy. For our listeners who want to dive into the specifics of the trajectories or the multicenter demographics, I highly recommend pulling the full text of Sadegzadeh et al. From the November 25th/February 26th collection.
It's a great read for anyone interested in the intersection of stereotactic surgery and neuromodulation.
Well, that's our time for today. Thank you, Dr. Ilara, for breaking down this study with me.
My pleasure, Dr. Aris.
To our listeners, stay curious, keep reading, and we'll see you next time on the Neurosurgery Hub podcast.
Goodbye, everyone.